The second Pompeian style, also known as the architectural style, lasted from circa 80 to circa 20 BC. Its characteristic features are the continuing inclusion of first-style rhomboidal panels. Incidentally, Wheeler does not cite any examples of first-style paintings. He is only interested in rhomboidal paneling. Returning to the second style, however, it is typified by the inclusion of architectural elements, such as columns, architraves, pediments and arches. These architectural elements give the style its nickname, but they also split the composition into zones of perspective, and due to there being several zones marked out by architectural borders in the foreground, the paintings are said to possess zones of multi-point perspective, which in turn create the illusion of spatial extension. It's as if the room extends beyond the wall into a wider world, just out of reach, but there. Some of these smaller panels were used for still life scenes, in which this illusion of depth was enhanced by the subtle gradation of color to suggest shading. Let's look at the painting Wheeler cites from the Villa of Mysteries in Pompeii. Whenever you describe a painting, it's always useful to imagine you are describing it for someone who can't see, and to essentially repaint it from a blank canvas. It's useful to use terms like right, left, and center, along with back, mid, and foreground to plot each element in the composition. Let's have a go. Are you ready? 3 Corinthian columns rise up in the foreground, splitting the background into 2 zones of perspective. The left zone is slightly wider than the right. They support an architrave with a green band running along its middle, but the architrave is split on the left. A core-built arch bridges a gap. Another more elaborately decorated architrave, carrying a red band, runs across the midground of the painting from left to right, and between the pair of columns to the right foreground, 2 more Corinthian columns can be seen behind, supporting a perpendicular spur from this midground architrave. Its short end is crowned by small embellishments, 2 on each side, flanking a larger central one, and the red band beneath carries a mask. The wall that supports this horizontal architrave in the midground is decorated in what looks like first-style rhomboidal paneling, a series of vivid green rectangular panels first, bordered by a series of gilded bands running across the midground, between there and the architrave above, a kind of checkerboard pattern of gold blocks on a green background. Above this midground structure, the back wall is made of green bricks, but on the left side there appears to be an inverted semicircular void, which joins with the arch in the foreground, to form a kind of surreal circular portal, through which we see a circular Corinthian shrine-like building, looming in the extreme background. How do we know what style it is? It counts as an example of the second, or architectural style, which lasted from circa 80 to circa 20 BC, for the following reasons. Firstly, the architectural elements in the foreground, the Corinthian columns, the architrave and non-functional core-built arch break the monotony and divide the scene up into zones of multi-point perspective. Secondly, we note the inclusion of first-style rhomboidal panels. And thirdly, the painting creates the illusion of spatial extension, which is enhanced by the vibrancy of the colors. In fact, if you notice the shading on the columns, there is even a fake light source, as if the sun is shining down from the top right-hand corner. This makes sense when you look at the painting in its original context. It originally decorated a small alcove of the conclave, and the door to the room was to the right of this painting, as indicated by the painting's light source. Why does Wheeler include this painting in his book? He cites this painting during his examination of Emperor Diocletian's palace at Split on pages 146 and 7. He is interested in the non-functional elements of architecture that take on an aesthetic, or arty quality of their own, in this case the non-functional arch in the painting. He notes that such features were not actually realized in architecture until a century later in the baths at Herculaneum, and were not built on a large scale until they were incorporated into the design of Diocletian's palace at Split in Croatia, nearly 2 centuries later. They are also present in the new Forum at Leptis Magna. This painting therefore anticipates something that was not copied in reality for a long time after it was painted. Let's move on to some examples of small still life panels. Let's describe this still life from Herculaneum. This is a little easier to describe. Are you ready? In the foreground, we see a tabletop set against a wall with a ledge 2/3 up the length of the painting. There is a silver vase with white ribbons tied to its handles in the center foreground on the table. It is decorated with the embossed figure of a Triton. A scatter of mussels and oysters surround the vase to the right and left, and a lobster appears at the extreme left foreground. The array of seafood is surveyed by a kingfisher perched on the edge of the ledge, over the table in the center midground, whilst 2 cuttlefish sit to his left on the ledge, with their tentacles draped over the side. There is an ornamental trident leaning across the vase, and up against the ledge, to the right, forming a diagonal line that terminates in the top right corner of the composition. How do we know what style it is? It counts as an example of the second, or architectural style, that lasted from circa 80 to circa 20 BC, because it's a still life. The second architectural style is typified by walls that were split up into zones of multipoint perspective by architectural elements in the foreground. Some of the smaller panels were decorated with still life scenes like this one. The second style created the illusion of spatial extension. This scene is a window onto a delicious meal in waiting. The subtle shading even suggests that it is evening time, as the strong low light coming from the far right of the painting makes a bright shine on the neck of the vase, and throws the rest of the painting into extremes of light and shade. The meal is les fruits de mer, seafood, the rewards of fishing, as the kingfisher, the trident and the trident symbolize. Let's now look at these two paintings from the house of Julia Felix in Pompeii. We see a block set against a wall in both paintings. A bowl of eggs sits on the center of the block in the first, whilst a glass fruit bowl laden with apples and grapes appears at the center of the other block. The bowl of eggs is flanked on the left by a silver beaker with the ladle balanced across its rim, whilst a half-peeled pomegranate lies to the left of the fruit bowl. A glass jug sits to the right of the bowl of eggs, whilst an apple sits to the right of the fruit bowl. Crowning the first composition, two pairs of dead thrushes hang by their beaks from a hook on the wall above the bowl of eggs, a cloth hangs from a hook on the wall to the right background, and a small amphora leans against the block to the right foreground. In the second painting, three storage amphorae sit against the wall in the right background. The central one is laden with grapes. How do you know what style it is? It counts as an example of the second, or architectural style, which lasted from circa 80 to circa 20 BC for the following reasons. The second, or architectural style is typified by walls that were split up into zones of multipoint perspective by architectural elements in the foreground. Some of the smaller panels were decorated with still life scenes, like these ones. The second style created the illusion of spatial extension. These scenes are windows onto delicious meals in waiting. In both cases, meals procured from a country garden. The illusion of depth is further enhanced in these paintings, by the warping of the edge of the block, viewed through the empty glass jug in the first painting, and by the transparency of the fruit bowl in the second. Subtle application of shading in both scenes even suggests that it is evening time, as the strong low light coming from the far left of the paintings casts long shadows. Both scenes suggest meals in waiting. The first one perhaps suggests a medley of roast songbird with an omelette on the side. The second one suggests fresh fruit salad or perhaps cider and wine, since the fruit seems to have been just harvested. In both cases the work is finished. Now eat. In fact, someone has already started peeling the pomegranate in the second painting. It looks juicy and ripe. Which meal would you prefer, fresh fruit or an omelette? They both must have been painted very realistically, to make you so hungry. The artist's conveyance of depth, by way of the foreshortening of the sides of the two blocks, and the warping of the glass, the shaded long shadows, and curve of the eggs and fruit, and his use of color to realistically portray the thrushes, and the ripened fruit, must all have been masterful. Incidentally, if you take these paintings in their original contexts, they both decorated panels on either side of the entrance into the peristyle of the garden of the house of Julia Felix in Pompeii. Perhaps guests of Julia Felix enjoyed roast songbirds and fresh fruit from her garden. This last example of the second style comes from Prima Porta, just outside Rome, and although it counts as second style, it does not necessarily date to the same time, because Rome lies beyond the reach of Mount Vesuvius. The best date we can give it is the Augustan period, because the house was built for Emperor Augustus's wife Livia. This painting is called the Garden of Livia. Let's describe the painting. A low wicker fence runs across the foreground, with a gap at its center. Behind, a grass verge punctuated with the odd bushel, runs along a low paling wall, with an alcove that accommodates a sapling poplar tree at the center midground. In the background behind this wall, we see an orchard, with a pomegranate tree to the left, and an apple tree to the right, as well as a variety of other blossoming bushes and trees. In the extreme background, we see a distant tree line looming through the haze, against the blue sky. A variety of songbirds perch on branches in the garden, and a field mouse even gambols on the grass verge near the poplar. What style is it? It counts as an example of the second, or architectural style, and dates to the Augustan period, at the turn of the century between BC and AD. The second architectural style is typified by walls that were split up into zones of multi-point perspective, by architectural elements in the foreground. In this case the wicker fence and low paling wall. The second style created the illusion of spatial extension. This scene is a window onto a beautifully landscaped garden. Just out of reach, but there. The illusion of depth is created by the grass verge leading up to the paling wall, with an alcove with foreshortened sides. At the end of his commentary on Roman mosaics, Wheeler says on page 183, that lost paintings lay behind the emblemata of Opus Vermiculata mosaics, and he cites the Garden of Livia as one masterpiece, and later on page 185, in the caption for illustration 166, he calls it a masterpiece of Roman landscape painting. He is especially struck by the artist's use of vibrant colors and shading. The blues and greens create the illusion of a hazy summer day in an orchard. He recalls how the Lithuanian-born art historian, Bernard Berenson, once likened the pomegranates in the Garden of Livia to those of the 19th-century French Impressionist Renoir. On the subject of perspective, Wheeler thinks the painting is stylized, meaning he thinks the perspective does not quite work but is nonetheless excusable. Taken in isolation, the poplar trees, he says, look like cardboard cutouts, and the birds in the background and foreground are the same size. Form, however, is of little interest to the Impressionist painter. The artist has captured the relaxed mood of a hazy summer's day, spent in an orchard, perfectly. It is an idyllic scene where even the little field mouse in the foreground is at ease. In fact, on page 185, Wheeler cites the Roman historian Pliny the Elder, who, in his Natural History, ascribed the habit of painting such scenes as landscape gardens, to an Augustan artist by the name of Spurius Tadius. Perhaps, Spurius Tadius painted the Garden of Livia? And maybe Pliny himself, once gazed on this painting, as we might do today, in its new housing in the National Roman Museum, in Palazzo Maximo Alitame, in Rome. It is always useful to note a painting's original context. This painting is a segment of a larger four-wall mural, that originally decorated the walls of the vaulted cellar, in the House of Livia, in Prima Porta, just outside Rome. That is why it survived antiquity. It was buried underground in a dark cellar. It cannot have been an uninviting place, however. Not with the Garden of Livia to take your breath away. That concludes Wheeler's commentary on the second Pompeian style. The next video will walk you through Wheeler's commentary on the third, or ornamental style.